Ever feel like everyone's talking in this secret code, when it comes to like international finance?
Right?
Well, we're cracking the code today.
Yeah.
We're going deep on international finance with this book by Michael Connolly. It's called International Business Finance.
Okay.
I think it's really interesting because it starts out like way back when. Like, we think about money now, it's all ones and zeros, right?
Yeah.
Digital, whatever.
Right.
But it's actually started out, the book talks about how back in ancient China, they were using shells and tools as like actual currency.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to think about those early forms of money, right? Like, can you imagine trading an extra, like, fish you caught or something for it, like a beautifully crafted spear point?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like essential items becoming the building blocks for, an economy.
Yeah, it really highlights that whole idea of like, what is value?
Exactly.
And how do we measure it? And then fast forward, and China does it again.
Right.
They're like, boom, paper money.
Game changer.
Total game changer. Yeah. Although it has led to some issues.
Well, yeah. The book talks about what happened in Argentina back in 2001, and it's a great example of how, like, when a government prints too much money, things can go south very quickly.
Yeah, tell me about that. What happened?
So basically, the Argentine government, they went on this, like, money printing spree, and people saw their savings, like, literally evaporate because, as they print more money, everything becomes more expensive.
Like inflation?
Inflation, exactly. And people were so fed up. They were out in the streets protesting with signs that said, no more painted paper. Painted paper.
It really captures this sentiment, right?
Yeah, because it's basically worthless.
Yeah.
It's not backed by anything. And, I mean, it highlights how much power the government has.
Absolutely. And that's where this whole concept of seigniorage comes into play.
Seigniorage. Okay, break that down for me.
Yeah, so seigniorage is basically the profit that a government makes by just, creating money.
Interesting.
So, like, you think about it, it costs them almost nothing to print a bill.
Right.
But that bill has value, right?
Yeah.
That difference, that's seigniorage.
Okay.
It's a powerful tool.
Yeah.
But like we were saying with Argentina, it can be really dangerous if it's not used responsibly.
Right, because if you have too much painted paper floating around,
Exactly.
it's not good for anybody.
You get hyperinflation, the economy tanks. Yeah. Nobody wins.
Nobody wins.
Okay, so we've got all this money floating around out there. Dollars, euros, yen.
Right.
How do we even begin to figure out, like, what they're actually worth in relation to each other?
That is the million-dollar question.
Literally.
Literally. And that's where we get into this idea of purchasing power parity, or PPP.
PPP. Catchy?
Right. And the book uses a really interesting example to illustrate this, the Big Mac Index.
Hold on, the Big Mac.
Yeah.
Like the burger.
You got it. Might seem a little out there, but it actually makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
So the idea behind PPP is that the same goods should cost roughly the same in different countries once you factor in the exchange rates.
Okay.
So if a Big Mac costs $5 in the US and, say, 400 yen in Japan, the exchange rate should, in theory, reflect that difference.
Interesting. So like a Big Mac becomes this universal measuring stick.
In a way, yeah. I mean, it's not a perfect system.
Right.
The book talks about how things like transportation costs, local taxes, even like the cost of ingredients can vary.
Sure.
But it gives you a general idea of whether a currency might be overvalued or undervalued at a glance.
Okay, so it's like a starting point.
Exactly.
A quick way to wrap your head around these big, complex ideas.
And it highlights something really important about the global economy. It's all connected.
Right.
What happens in one place can impact prices on the other side of the world.
We're all part of this giant, messy, delicious Big Mac of an economy.
Exactly.
So we've talked about the history of money, how we compare currencies. But what happens when companies get involved? I mean, doing business across borders, that's got to come with a whole other layer of financial, acrobatics?
Oh, absolutely. And the book dives into some of those key mechanisms like letters of credit, transfer pricing.
Yeah, those always sound so intimidating.
It can be, but they're also incredibly important for facilitating global trade.
Okay, so break it down for me. Like, what exactly is a letter of credit? It sounds very official.
It is. So imagine you're a business and you want to buy a massive shipment of, I don't know, coffee beans from, say, Colombia.
Okay.
A letter of credit is basically your bank stepping in and saying, hey, Colombian coffee exporter, we guarantee that you'll get paid for those beans, even if something happens to our buyer over here.
Oh, so it's like a safety net.
Exactly. It reduces risk for both sides and makes international trade a lot smoother.
Okay, that makes sense. But then there's transfer pricing. That one always makes me think of, like, accounting magic tricks.
Uh-huh. I can see why. It can get pretty complex. Essentially, transfer pricing comes into play when you have these big multinational companies.
Okay.
And they're moving goods or services between different parts of their own company, but those different parts are in different countries.
Okay. I'm following so far.
So, for example, imagine a company that makes, I don't know, smartphones.
Okay.
And they've got a subsidiary in, say, Ireland.
Ireland, famous for its business-friendly tax rates.
Exactly. So this company might decide to sell their smartphones to their Irish subsidiary at a lower price than they would to an independent buyer. Well, it's a way for them to potentially reduce their overall tax burden.
So it's all a game of strategy.
You could see that.
Trying to keep as much of that profit as possible while still, playing by the rules, or at least bending them a little.
Well, there are definitely ethical considerations to keep in mind when we talk about transfer pricing, but that's a conversation for another time.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. I like it. But for now, it sounds like understanding these concepts, letters of credit, transfer pricing.
It's about understanding the tools and tactics that businesses use to navigate the global marketplace.
And maybe even level up our own financial game in the process.
Exactly.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, International finance.
It's a journey.
It really is. And it kind of feels like the more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn.
It's true. It's a deep rabbit hole, but it's also kind of exciting, right?
Yeah.
Like you start to see the connections everywhere.
Yeah, and I'm realizing it's not about memorizing, like, every single detail. It's more about understanding these core concepts so you can kind of navigate the whole thing.
Exactly. You don't need to be a, master mechanic to appreciate a well-running engine,
I like that, yeah.
You can still understand the basic principles.
And speaking of basic principles, can we circle back to that idea of seigniorage?
Sure.
Because I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface, and I'm still a little fuzzy on, the implications of it.
Okay, yeah.
Because it seems like on the surface, it's like free money for governments.
Yeah.
Awesome. Just print more bills.
Right. If only it were that simple. It's
Right.
just a very delicate balance.
Okay. Because, too much of a good thing. Right. So you think about it. If a country's in a recession, one of the tools that governments have is they can increase the money supply. Right. To try and stimulate the economy. Right. Get people spending again. And in some cases, that can be really effective. Yeah. But if they go overboard, if they print way too much money, that's when you get inflation. Right. Because then the money's not worth as much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like anything else, right? If something's too plentiful, it loses its value.
Right. Supply and demand.
Right.
Economics 101.
Exactly. And that's why understanding this idea of seigniorage, it helps you make sense of all these other things.
Right.
Like when you hear about central banks adjusting interest rates,
Right.
or governments debating stimulus packages.
Oh, related.
It's all tied to this idea of managing the money supply.
So it's like you can impress your friends with your financial knowledge at your next dinner party.
Exactly.
Hey, did you know that the Federal Reserve just tweaked the discount rate? Let me tell you all about seigniorage.
You'll be the life of the party.
Exactly. But no, really, it's about connecting those dots.
Absolutely.
Because once you understand these concepts, it's like you can start to see the bigger picture.
Yeah, you're not just lost in the weeds anymore.
Exactly.
You can actually navigate the system.
So we've talked about this in, kind of big picture terms. But for our listener out there who's thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but how does it apply to me? Like in my day-to-day life, in my business?
Right. How do we actually use this information?
Yeah. So let's bring it down to earth a little bit. Give me an example.
Okay. So let's say you're a small business owner, right?
Okay.
And you're thinking about importing, I don't know, let's say you sell handmade jewelry.
Okay.
And you want to import some beautiful beads from, I don't know, Bali.
Okay. Beautiful beads from Bali. I love it.
Right. So understanding exchange rates can literally make or break your profit margin.
Right. Because if the, the rupiah?
The Indonesian rupiah, yeah.
If that fluctuates, then suddenly your beads are a lot more expensive.
If the rupiah weakens against the dollar, you're going to be able to buy more beads.
Right, yeah.
Your costs go down.
This is good stuff.
Right.
Okay.
But it gets even more interesting when you start thinking about bigger businesses, multinational corporations, and we go back to that concept of transfer pricing.
Ooh, yes. Transfer pricing. The
accounting magic trick.
Right. Where we were talking about Like it felt very high stakes.
High stakes, absolutely.
Like we'd stumbled into a poker game or something.
Because it is, I mean,
High rollers.
these are massive companies moving around huge sums of money. And so understanding transfer pricing, it's not just about like, are they following the rules or not? It's about understanding like
The strategy.
the strategy behind it.
Okay.
Why are they doing this? How does it benefit them?
Right. It's like a giant game of chess, but with like real world consequences.
Absolutely. And it can get really complex really fast.
But that's part of what makes it so fascinating.
It is. And this is where, I think it's important to not shy away from those complexities.
Right.
Because once you start to understand them, you can start to ask some really interesting questions.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, we talked about how companies use transfer pricing to potentially reduce their tax burden, right?
Right.
But that also means that governments are collecting less in tax revenue.
Right.
So then that raises the question, is that fair?
Right. Because that tax revenue funds, schools and roads and
Exactly.
all the things.
So it's not just about the financial mechanics of it.
Right.
It's about the broader impact.
The ethical implications.
Exactly.
So understanding international finance, it's not just about making money, it's about...
It's about understanding power.
Ooh, I like that.
Right. Who has it? How do they use it? And what are the consequences of that?
And how does it affect, the average person? Even if we're not, high-flying financiers ourselves.
Because at the end of the day, it does affect all of us, whether we realize it or not.
So it's like a giant puzzle.
It is, and we all have a piece of it.
And the more pieces we can put together.
The clearer the picture becomes.
I love it. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From ancient coins to modern-day tax havens.
It's a lot.
It is. It's funny. I always pictured international finance as this like high-stakes casino.
Yeah.
People in suits making deals, but...
Lots of jargon.
Yes. Lots of jargon. And like flashing numbers on screens. But this deep dive, it's really shown me it's so much more than that.
It really is. It's interconnected.
Yeah.
It's really about relationships, about strategy.
And like you said, it's global.
Absolutely.
It's huge. And speaking of global, I'm remembering this term from the book, and it sounds like something out of like a spy movie. It's called the SWIFT system.
Mm-hmm.
What is that all about?
Oh, the SWIFT system. Yeah, so it sounds very secretive, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually just the backbone of how all these international financial communications happen.
Okay.
So think of it like
Like a messaging system for banks.
Exactly, yeah. A messaging system for banks, but instead of sending cat videos, they're sending payment orders and confirmations.
Oh, wow. So like trillions of dollars flowing through this system.
Every day.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So behind every global purchase, every investment, there's this network making sure the money ends up where it needs to.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean, that's how interconnected things are.
It's really mind-blowing.
Really?
And it makes you realize, like, even if we don't work in finance, even if we're not, traders on Wall Street,
Right.
understanding these systems, even just like the basics.
It makes you a more informed citizen of the world.
Exactly.
Because you can understand the decisions that are being made and how they might affect you.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we've successfully cracked the code of international finance, at least for one day.
Maybe just scratch the surface.
Right. There's always more to learn.
Always.
That's the fun of it. Well, thanks for diving in with me.
Always a pleasure.
And to all our listeners, we'll see you on our next deep dive.